thanks to Duke Energy and the North Carolina Electric Co-ops and E4 Carolina for all your support during this conference. And David, thank you for the work you've done to get us all organized. So obviously, we're the cleanup panel here. We'll see what we can do about that. But I have a couple of observations, and then I'm going to introduce each panel member when it's their time to talk. I'm not going to go through each. When it's their turn, I will do a brief introduction. But you can see who they are up on the screen. So the title of our conference today is Getting to 2050. What the undertow there is getting to 2050 with near zero or net zero carbon emissions, and so it's sort of a trip to get there. And saying something a little bit about the Center for Climate and Energy Solution. We're a nonprofit, a nonpartisan think tank, and we've actually looked at the issue of trying to get to zero, which is, I think, why David and others have asked me to do a little introduction here. But it gets pretty complicated, and our panel, which is looking beyond the assets, what are the additional considerations for getting to 2050? Well, the simple answer to that is everything is beyond the assets. Everything out there that uses electricity is beyond the assets. And so it's a pretty wide-ranging conversation I think we can have here. But one of the keys and one of the reasons that we're having this part of the conversation is not only because the impact going back toward the power system, but also electricity and decarbonizing electricity is central. It's a central element to decarbonizing the economy. You can't do it without having the electric system be decarbonized. And decarbonizing the electric system is something we generally know how to do it. I mean, we don't know how to get all the way there yet. We sort of have a lot of ideas. You heard a lot of that in the previous panels. But it certainly is a central element. And if we decarbonize the power sector, then obviously one of the other key elements of the decarbonization of the economy is to then try to electrify as much as you can. And you heard in the last panel there are estimates that if we do that fully with, let's say, buildings and transportation, we could close to double the amount of electricity generation we need over the next 30 or so years. So not only is there a decarbonizing challenge, but there's also a growth in the use of electricity if those other sectors start to electrify. So electrifying is going to be one of the things that we want to think through during this discussion, and no doubt. Now, another thing that came up in many of the other panels that I think is an important factor here is the cost of doing this. Since I've been involved with environmental issues, and David gave a little bit of a background on that, cost has always been an issue, and it's always been a worry, and we always worry. I'm not going to say this that you shouldn't worry about it. We obviously need to worry about it, and we need to manage it for all kinds of issues, including the economy as well as lower income customers, and small shop owners, et cetera. So, but one of the things that we've discovered over time is that often as we get into it and we learn, we find ways to do things with less costs. And so what we thought was going to be very expensive turns out to be less expensive once we get our feet wet, once we start doing it. I guess getting your feet wet is not a good thing to talk about when you're talking about electricity. So a case in point, in the last 15 years or so, the power sector nationally has reduced greenhouse gas emissions by well over 20%. And in North Carolina, for instance, it's closer to 30%. And, 15 years ago, we said to reduce the power sector's greenhouse gas emissions by 25, 30% in 15 years, that'll cost everybody double the power rate, double the cost of electricity. Well, it turns out it didn't. We found ways to do it. We found lower cost and reliable natural gas. The price of renewables and wind energy has continued to decline. We've made advances in battery technology. So I think this idea of innovation is really important as we go forward. And so where does that innovation take place? It takes place in the field from trial and error, but it also takes place in our academic institutions and our government labs. So it's important to know that that's out there, and that even in recent history, we've made significant progress in the power sector on greenhouse gases, which I think is what's given many companies and players in the field confidence that in another 30 years we can achieve the kind of goals people are talking about. But it won't be without a struggle. So some of the other things to consider, and then I'm going to start, and then I'll get the panel going here, is things like consumer choice. Once you move away from the assets of the power sector and you start talking about what's going to happen, what the electricity is needed for, you start talking about how do people shop, what's powering the home, what are you cooking with, what is the heating and the air conditioning, the lighting, transportation. We have more and more electric transportation, more choices in transportation. Everybody may not have a car; they'll be on demand. So there's all these consumer choices that are going to be important. Partners that never really were thought of in the past. I just mentioned transportation systems, but you also have probably a growing partnership between communities, cities, local neighborhoods. Even when you're talking about distributed power and microgrids, you're talking about a different relationship there that's beyond the assets that we currently think about. People who design buildings, architects, engineers, and then I think equally important, and I'll try to follow this through the panel, and I'll just say this very quickly. When I started in the environmental protection industry business, so to speak, it was always about, well, what do we need to get to in terms of our pollution reduction, and then how do we just tell cities or businesses that they have to do it, what the technology is that seems to be out there, and then put them on a schedule, give them a permit or something. What we have now are companies, including some of them that are participating today, many that are participating today, saying we want to get to a zero or net zero greenhouse gases by 2050. So we don't, in a way, we don't need like a law or a regulation to tell them to do it. They are out there now saying they want to do it. What we need now, and I'm throwing this out as a hypothesis, what we need now are policies and programs that will help them do it. And so it's like a different flip on the old relationship there between government agencies and private sector and how they achieve these goals. So these are some high level thoughts on what's going on beyond the assets, how important electricity is, and then all these other related issues. So I'm going to turn to the panel now. We have a great panel here. I'm sure by now you guys have read who's here, but let me start. I mean, we're going to go in the order that we have here. And first up is Diane Huis, who is the Senior Vice President for Innovation and Business Development at North Carolina's Electric Co-ops. I should say cooperatives. She's responsible for working with member co-ops throughout the state to identify and incorporate beneficial electrification opportunities. I was just mentioning the electrification possibilities, and she's worked on transportation and industry, the agriculture relationships, grid flexibility. She's worked on wholesale power. Diane graduated from Georgia Tech with a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering, and she's a registered professional engineer in the state of North Carolina. So, Diane, over to you.
Great, thank you. It's been great so far. I hope I have little bit more to add that y'all will find interesting. So if I can get my slide to press. So the North Carolina Electric Co-ops, we are focused now on a brighter future, and we've always had a mission to provide reliable, safe, low-cost power. And now we're really focused even more on additional things that we can do for our communities and, ways to just provide more solutions to help them achieve a brighter future, including our long-range goal of the net zero emissions portfolio by 2050. So to get there, we are focused on beneficial electrification. And what that is the ability to use technologies that use electricity when it can do one of these four things without harming any of the other. And this is important because if you can do this, you can provide benefits not only to the electric cooperative through a more efficient utilization of the assets that are out there, but you can also actually help the end use consumer and the communities they serve. We see beneficial electrification as a way to help the environments in some of the places that are harder hit quite often, and to improve the quality of life for these consumers as well, as a lot of these technologies can just do things more efficiently. One of the reasons that this is the case is because electricity is getting cleaner over time. Bob, you mentioned this, and I've heard it mentioned several times. Progressed from 2005, you can see how the mix of resources have changed to be very much more dependent on assets that don't include coal, and we know the long-term plans are to retire those existing coal units. There's still a strong emphasis on nuclear, which we see as being very important going forward, and natural gas as well. Renewables are continuing to increase. And this is the EIA projection of carbon intensity. And you can see that our region, the United States as a whole, so we are actually ahead. So if you're familiar with beneficial electrification, often you'll see the national statistics, and I think it's important to point out that we're in an even better place to electrify. So the co-ops are focusing on beneficial electrification in four main areas, as you can see here. I'm going to talk about one of these, and I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background as to how we got interested in beneficial electrification. For us, it started in 2018 when we saw EPRI's National Electrification Assessment. My CEO, Joe Biden, was on the board of EPRI at the time, and he had me sit in on a committee that was helping get the first electrification conference going. It was an international conference focused on electrification and the benefits it could bring. And what that talked about was how by increasing the share of electricity out through time, you could actually reduce the carbon footprint of the economy as a whole simply by electrifying. This was in a regular assessment case. If you had additional carbon reduction policies in place for the electric utilities, the impact was bigger. When we saw that, we were very interested. We were excited. I mean, we've all been, a lot of the people I know in this conference are in this industry, and we provide electricity is what we do, but to be able to provide a product that is actually helping the environment clean up I just think it's an amazing message. And personally, I got really excited about it, and we really got behind this. And we actually partnered with Duke Energy to have EPRI do a study for the state of North Carolina. And at the end of my presentation, I have some links to get to these studies. But what this study showed was in North Carolina, the impact that could happen because of electrification. And you can see here in this chart that the top bar is electrification of transportation. If you can convert cars to electric vehicles, you can actually reduce economy-wide the energy use by transportation by 59%. You'll also notice in this graph that buildings will use less energy as you go out through time. They'll use less electricity. In North Carolina, we are heavily electrified when it comes to buildings, much more so than, say, the Northeast. And that's okay. We're not saying that you need to add electricity just to add electricity, but we're saying you need to do sense. And one of the ways that we're doing that is by heavily focusing on electric transportation. And this shows the co-op's EV charging network. A few of these chargers are still in the process of being installed. We recently invested $1 million to install 10 DC fast chargers and 11 level 2 chargers across the state. We were recently awarded about $700,000 of the Volkswagen emissions funds to help fund another 10 DC fast chargers. Those are shown in orange on this map. And you'll see that many of our chargers are in the rural part of the state. And I know we talk a lot, or you hear a lot about how electric transportation benefits those who have more money. And, you know, we look at it as electric transportation and the ability to use EVs is critical to continue to bring tourists to our state, to have people visit the areas of the state that our co-ops serve. We're in these rural, beautiful parts of the state. There were no chargers there. And I drive an electric car. Being there is half the fun. And so I want to drive my EV when I go on vacation, and I won't go somewhere if I can't charge on the way and when I get there. We're also very interested in electrifying transportation in other areas as well. So an electric school bus, we're very pleased to, through a partnership, Bob mentioned how important these partnerships are. We have a partnership with the DPI and Randolph EMC and the Randolph schools to hopefully get this bus going there. So we see this for the rural parts of the state, that these electric school buses, again, can improve the environment for the students that will be riding these buses through less fumes on the bus, quieter atmosphere, and it can help use electricity when utilization is low. Solutions is what we're looking to do for our industrial and agricultural member consumers, and that artificial electrification and sustainable technologies or renewables. The technologies that we're looking at cover a wide range, but we did some market research and we looked at what are the best fits. So this just shows some of those that we're focused on, and we feel like this is an area where people aren't talking about the benefits of electricity. And so what we're doing is trying to make sure that these benefits are known and clear to the people that could use them, that can make them much more efficient and competitive with other this industry in other states. It's, again, an economic development issue. When it comes to sustainable technology, if you can pair renewables on site, or maybe it's renewables through RECs, with those electric technologies, you can really have a home run for these accounts that often now are held to very high sustainability goals by the companies that they're supplying to. Charlie Bayless mentioned Roseacre Farms. This is an example of one of those partnerships that we have. Farms produces over 2 million eggs a day. They supply to Walmart, so they're part of Project Gigaton. They needed renewables, so we partnered with them and Childress EMC to have renewables on site along with storage. And this is the type of solution that we're looking to help our member consumers with. And, you know, it's good for them, it's good for the co-ops, and it's, partnerships all the way. When it comes to residential consumers, we talked a lot about different ways to get more distributed energy resources out there, and we agree with that. I mean, those resources go all the way down to devices in the home, such as thermostats and water heaters, and of course EVs. The beauty of electric vehicles is that not only does it grow energy, but it can also help you manage peaks. That EPRI study I mentioned on North Carolina showed that by 2050 in the state of North Carolina, there could be up to 5,000 megawatts of demand response using electric vehicle charging. I mean, that's huge if we can avoid adding power plants by having those batteries and having that charging incorporated into our system. So those what we're doing to get to a brighter future beyond the traditional assets and the T&D system. That's what I have.
I have to remember to unmute myself. I just said some very amazing things, but like about what you said, Diane, and now I forgot what it was. Anyway, I don't see anybody asking questions yet for you, and I'm going to wait to the end to go through some of my questions. So let's keep going through the panel. That was great. You guys are really hitting on all the cylinders there. Our next speaker is Al Ripley. He's the Director of Consumer and Housing Project at the North Carolina Justice Project. You heard me mention at the beginning, the relationship between consumers and local communities is evolving here, and I think Al will be able to give us some insight from the perspective of his work. He works on consumer housing policy and other consumer actions. He's worked at the self-help credit unions, knowledgeable on the financing side, and he works on consumer and housing policy advocacy. He said got a bachelor's of art in political science and also a law degree from UNC Chapel Hill and education from North Carolina State University. So, Al, you're up.
Thanks so much, Bob, for that introduction. And David, thanks for having me today. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. And David's kind enough to run my slide presentation. I'm in an area without a lot of high bandwidth, so hopefully this will work. But if you have any problems, just wave. I can see you on the monitor there. Why don't we go ahead to the next slide, if you don't mind. The Justice Center, if you're not familiar with our organization, we represent the interests of low-income individuals and communities across North Carolina, and are constantly looking at ways to help low-income communities. So I wanted to start with some very brief and simple statistics. And of course, in light of the developments around COVID and job loss, I think that these statistics are inherently stale and have changed a lot. But back in 2016, around 15.4% of North Carolinians, or 1,563,000 people, were living in poverty in the state. I think it's important just to recognize that that's a lot of people, a high percentage of our population. And as we look at 2050 and how we want to improve the grid and lower carbon, we always have to be mindful of costs and the impacts on consumers. And I would love to get to a place where in 2050, we had a dynamic where everyone could afford to pay for electricity, where everybody was connected to the grid, and utilities could get rid of their default disconnect offices. And we've got to figure out how we can get there. One idea proposal is to have a special low-income tariff for low-income ratepayers so that they can afford the electricity that they're buying. And then there are other initiatives that have been mentioned today and ways to save energy and save costs that I think we need to keep pursuing. We go to the next slide. When we look at energy burden, another way to consider this is how many families in North Carolina pay more than 6% of their income for energy. And back in 2016, that was around, again, 1.5 million households. Now, of course, when you talk of households, it's more than just one individual. They might have 2 kids and a spouse. And so it's a lot of people. Multiply that 1 million by 3. There's a lot of people that are living in these dynamics where their energy costs are simply not affordable. We go to the next slide, please. Part of these dynamics that's important to keep in mind is that when you talk about energy burden, it also has a direct correlation to housing. Right now, we are in a housing crisis where we have a lot of people that cannot afford to pay their rent. But as many of us know on today's presentation, that we also have a lot of people that are behind in their utilities and are in arrears. If you're going to stay in a safe and healthy home environment, you've got to be able to pay your electric bill, all your utility bills, and your rent or your mortgage. And so it's important to take both of these into account. And this statistic, for example, many extremely low-income renters pay more than 30% of their income towards rent and utilities combined. So utility costs has an impact on housing because you really have to think of those two things together as we try to provide healthy homes for people to live in. We go to the next slide, please. So when you think of this in terms of, well, what are the solutions? The good thing is there are a lot of solutions out there. And one is how we think about grid modernization. Many folks, when you talk about grid modernization, it's everything in front of the meter. I'd like to take a minute to talk about things behind. And the reason is that in the communities that I serve, I'll go into people's homes and the appliances and systems in the home are incredibly old. I was in a home recently with a 16-year-old HVAC system with a water heater that was old electric resistance, highly inefficient, not well insulated, very poor weatherization in the home. And with some improvements, we were able to significantly reduce the costs for that homeowner to be able to afford the utilities and stay in that home. And one of the technologies that I have talked about a lot, and if you've heard me talk about it before, I apologize, but heat pump water heaters are incredibly efficient tools in the way that we heat water. And I hope that we can look more at how we evolve the grid to be connected to all devices behind the meter and take advantage of demand side management technologies, for example, utilizing thermal storage. So if we took 40,000 homes and we heated that water between 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning, and then through thermal storage, we're able to use that hot water throughout the day, we could move a lot of the cost of generating hot water off peak times, and we could provide those appliances to people that are low income. Now, we do have rebate programs right now, but I was working with a family recently that needed to replace their device. And in order to take advantage of the $350 rebate, they had to be able to buy the unit up front. And a lot of people simply don't have the $1,200 to $1,500 sitting in a bank account waiting to buy their new heat pump water heater. So we need to figure out how we can remove those obstacles that are getting in the way of low-income families acquiring those devices. One way, of course, would be to provide modern technology and modern appliances. That's one option. But other options, there are jurisdictions, for example, that have rental programs that are incredibly successful, where I might pay $6 or $7 on my bill every month. And instead of my owning the water heater, I simply rent it from my utility. My utility installs it for me. They manage it. They service it. When it needs to be replaced, they replace it. That way I am getting access to the modern technology when I need it, and I'm not having to come up with that upfront cost. Also, on-bill tariff financing is another financing tool that we should take a greater look at in North Carolina. There's a great co-op in Eastern North Carolina. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Roanoke that is using this type of financing to help their low-income members, and that's something that I hope our utilities in North Carolina will take a look at. If we go to the next slide, please. So transportation, we've had some great conversations about transportation and the potential for electric vehicles. I have to say that the people that need electric vehicles more than anyone else are low-income people in North Carolina. And let me explain why. If you look at some studies you could find online, a car with more than 150,000 miles on it has average maintenance costs of $240 a month. That's just to keep the vehicle running. That's not including your gasoline costs or any other costs that you have, just to keep the vehicle running. So if you look at a Nissan Leaf, for example, from last year, sticker price $30,000, that works out on a 96-month loan at around 5% to $391 a month. So we're closing the gap. The more we can get these electric vehicle costs down, closer to that $240 a month that it costs just to keep your old clunker running with 150,000 miles on it. There's opportunity there to get more electric vehicles into the hands of low-income families. And of course, we all know the benefits of electric vehicles. The maintenance costs are lower, the fuel costs are lower. And so that's something that I hope that we could achieve certainly before 2050 and hopefully in the nearer future. The other thing, of course, to look at are other models for auto ownership. I mean, subscription models, rideshare models, better mass transit. All these are opportunities to help low-income communities. And I know there's been discussion about the infrastructure and the charging infrastructure. That is particularly challenging for low-income communities because many people rent in multifamily settings, and there are very relatively few multifamily low-income housing projects that have the built-in infrastructure for families to be able to charge vehicles at home. And of course, you've got to be able to do that. If you're going to have an electric vehicle, you have to be able to charge it where you work or where you live. And so that's another obstacle that we have to look at. We go to the next slide, please. The urban-rural divide. This is something that I think does not get enough attention when we talk about challenges in the near future and looking out 30 years to 2050. But beneficial electrification is certainly something, particularly in rural areas, that we need to take a look at. There are still many, many people that rely on a propane truck showing up on a monthly basis to fill a tank with which they use to heat their homes, for example. That is a relatively inefficient way to transfer energy and has a higher cost, if you will, than if you live in an urban environment where you have greater access to energy options. High-speed internet. If we're going to have a connected, integrated grid with devices that talk to each other, you need to be in a place not like where I am today, where I barely have enough bandwidth to get on this webinar, but you need a high-speed internet connection. That is becoming imperative as we look at trying to have smart devices that talk to each other and could work together. And as many of you know, much of rural North Carolina does not, unfortunately, does not have high-speed internet access. And then finally, looking at opportunities for community solar and wind, and how can these resources be used to better benefit low-income communities? Could we, for example, envision a future where we have solar projects and wind projects that are developed exclusively or particularly for low-income ratepayers to help them lower their energy costs and lower their carbon footprint? And I think that's something that we should be taking a closer look at in the near future as well. So those are just hitting the highlights on those four areas. I'm happy to answer any questions, and you saw my contact information up at the top. If there's not time to talk today, I'm happy to talk in the future. And David, thank you so much for running that PowerPoint for me. I appreciate it.
All right. Al, thank you. We do have some questions coming in, and I'm going to interject a few here before we go to our next panel. And anybody on the panel can respond to these because it does cut across a little, even though it's been stimulated by the first two presentations. But one particularly, Diane, is related to the vehicle to grid connection and worries that electric vehicle owners may have about their battery usage and the wear and tear on the battery. And have you guys been thinking about that?
And what we're focused on, at least for now, is trying to incentivize EV owners to charge off-peak by using innovative rate structures. Several of our co-ops have time-of-use rates that will give a big advantage to charging off-peak. Another one of our co-ops, Roanoke, actually, has just rolled out a new EV charging tariff where you actually get essentially a subscription and you have to charge your car overnight between certain hours and you get unlimited or a certain amount of charging for a monthly fee. So we're starting that way. And it's interesting because, we belong to EPRI and I go to the electric transportation meetings, and the rate structures for the most part is the way that most of the utilities and research people are leaning rather than active charging management. I mentioned demand response, but I should have said, managed charging, which can be done through multiple methods.
Yeah. Many places that I've had the experience of working with around the country are looking at fleets rather than individual automobile owners to do the vehicle to grid interconnection, because, for instance, school buses, they're going to be parked most of the day, except for maybe the people with the sports teams running around, but we're not doing that now either. But you sort of know where the school buses are, and you can use them as a battery at that time. So I think it's an important issue on how that gets managed. I'm going to one more interjection here. Again, feel free, anyone, to chime in. But this land use conflict between solar and agriculture, that's one thing. I know when we talk through the rest of the panel, there's other intersections with agriculture. It's where most of the ethanol that we use, and 10% of the gasoline that we get now is ethanol. Sometimes it's higher. That's another how much corn goes to fuel versus to animals versus to people. This emerging and continuing to grow management issue on agriculture and renewable fuels is an interesting one. I'll throw it out there because I think both Diane and Al, you guys probably have some thoughts on this.
Okay, I'll start against Al's so I think it's been heartbreaking through the years to see farmers who are going to the co-ops and saying, can you bring solar power to my farm? I just want to lease my land. I can make more money by leasing my land than I can from farming. That's a real problem. And so I think that is just a really big issue that we have. And again, trying to figure out what technologies that we can bring to them to help make them more cost competitive and more efficient. I mean, that's why we're so focused on these electric technologies, like irrigation systems that you can control through an app. Again, it brings up internet. There's a lot of issues that are involved with that because you do need or cell technology to be able to control those devices, but really focused on trying to figure out how to make farms more competitive so that maybe we're not seeing farmland go away. We're also looking at ways to utilize property when it comes to places like hog farms, poultry farms, where there is land due to set-asides. Can we utilize that land for solar instead of taking land that could be used to grow food?
All right. Any one of you want to say anything? Otherwise, we're going to go to Ryan. All right. Well, next up is Ryan Childress, who is the Director of Gas Partnership Development at Dominion Energy, renewable gas effort. He was named the Director and of Business Development in 2019 and is responsible for Dominion's renewable natural gas business line. Speaking of Dominion, Ryan, that's your company has been looking at the buses as I talked about earlier, school buses. He joined Dominion in 2013, has been responsible for a number of different projects and business development activities. Before that, he's with Barclays, and he holds several degrees from the University of Virginia and an MBA from the Darden School of Business. So, Ryan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, Bob, thank you for that introduction. And David and E4, thank you for allowing me to participate on the panel. This is an interesting day and certainly an interesting way to look at this, the whole concept of beyond assets. So, David, also appreciate you tag teaming with me and running my slide deck. So before I kind of go through the slides, and I'm going to focus on certain slides, but hopefully we can provide these to the group because I would like for folks to be able to have this as some background additionally. But I really want to talk through three things, and it's really just conceptual, right? When we talk about beyond assets and what we're doing. Number one, in the energy industry, I think we're seeing a change in how stakeholders' desires and focus has evolved over time, right? We've seen that, frankly, on this panel. There's a little bit, almost of I think it's good tension between the absolute focus on carbon reduction, but then the core mission of us as energy professionals to provide reliable and affordable energy at the same time, right? And that may be really the bottom line of what we're all talking about, particularly on this panel. The second part of that is what innovation and technology have to be part of that, and how do you balance that from going to things that may not be there on the from the cost perspective first, but trying to get that down and managing that portfolio approach that was talked about earlier. And then the final thing is really how do we get there, right? We all talk about net zero by 2050. That's becoming a ubiquitous term. And what I would say is it's got to be a portfolio approach, but we also have to think differently. And so I want to point out, and today talk a little bit about what we think is a very unique initiative and approach to that. That's got a very important role to play, we believe, in North Carolina's energy future. So, David, if we could kind of click down now, the next slide, just a quick overview of Dominion. We're a very large, diversified utility on the electric and gas side. You can see our statistics there. go ahead to the next slide, David. I think we can. That's more background, and we're changing our orientation. We're really focused on, as I said, from stakeholder perspective, our investors want a bigger focus on ESG principles. They want to see us make commitments around getting to net zero, and we're going to do that by 2050. But at the same time, we're also, extremely focused on continuing to provide reliable and affordable energy to, our over 7 million customers. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the crux of what we're talking about, right? How do we get to net zero? I mentioned this, and so in the blue text, in the blue cartoons, if you will, you see what we have in place now. We've got, Bob pointed out, innovative programs like electric school buses, the largest offshore wind plant underway in our hemisphere, aggressive methane reduction goals on our gas infrastructure program, replacing aging infrastructure, but also investing in things like zero emissions maintenance equipment, so that we're not releasing fugitive methane into the atmosphere when we have to do maintenance under pressure. That's a huge thing, when you add up every molecule that you can capture. Continuing the transition from coal. There was a great graphic on that earlier. And then, extending nuclear licenses and focusing on energy and efficiency programs. That gets us, 80% of the way there. But, in the purple, it's what's next. And I'll talk about RNG because that's in progress too. But, it's battery technology, other energy storage. It's looking at green hydrogen. I'll touch on that because it's sort of adjacent to RNG. Carbon capture technologies and advanced nuclear. And then, we're still going to have to look for ways to invest in carbon capture. And then also, really to look at policy, the right policy structures that support this. So, well, I see some questions coming in, and this is a great transition to my next slide, please, David, which is, I believe, what is renewable natural gas? And renewable natural gas is actually, it's a waste. It's taking waste methane, whether that's from a landfill, from restaurant food waste, or from an agricultural installation like a hog farm, capturing that through anaerobic digestion, converting it to usable natural gas, and so it's truly taking waste to energy. And this gets at that sort of innovation thought. And it's when you can take something that right now, if you look at Eastern North Carolina, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth if you want to go to the next slide. What do these projects look like? And so if you look on the left of this graphic, that's if you've been in Duplin, Sampson County, any of the southeastern North Carolina counties, maybe on your way, either you live in those communities or on your way to one of the beautiful beaches near Wilmington. There are tons of these, hundreds and hundreds of these farms. And so by installing anaerobic digestion, the industry's there. They're raising these animals. It's a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week program. Owned by family farmers that contract with Smithfield and Prestige Foods and other large integrators. By capturing that methane, converting it and using it for energy, we're able to offset, traditional fossil usage. And if we go down to the next slide, David, the way to scale this, and to get this complete usable energy, you've got a completely clean waste stream. Next slide, please. This is just kind of showing the quality of gas. Well, the way we're going to scale this is on a couple different fronts. One, by partnering with Smithfield Foods, we've together agreed to put over the next decade $500 million, $500 million towards installing these. Over 90% of Smithfield's finishing capacity in North Carolina, as well as some other states that they do business in out west, Utah, Arizona, California, to name a few. We're also, we have two other partners on the dairy front, Vanguard and Rev LNG, and we have a strategic alliance with the Dairy Farmers of America nationally, where we also have $400 million in those partnerships, and that's fully funded by Dominion to do the same type of process in dairy farms across the country. So, we're not talking. I mean, you're getting upwards when you look at all the investment we have, almost $1 billion of investment, which is what we believe is the largest in the sector when it looks at RNG. Let's go to the next slide, please, David. So, when you look at the power of this and why we see this is so important as we look towards net zero, it's because at a very basic level, methane is 25 times more intense as a greenhouse gas than is CO2. So when you think about that, I mean, it's an incredible leverage point. The actual energy volume and the gas amounts are relatively small when you think about traditional, traditional gas development or, in the drilling sector. But when you think about this investment, you're looking at making almost, the equivalent of 750,000 cars every year off the road by capturing these emissions that otherwise would be going straight in the atmosphere. Methane also is more powerful in the near term. So if you look at over a 20-year period or a 10-year period, it's even more than 25 times destructive as a greenhouse gas. So from a carbon, what I call a carbon bang for your buck proposition, this is a no-brainer. And that's, kind of goes into Bob's earlier question about, what policies need to be. And what I would say, in a very basic way is, let's look at, the quickest way we get to reduce carbon, and agricultural RNG is at the top of that stack. Next slide, please, David. The other great thing about this is, and I spoke a little bit about on the other slide, our Dominion Energy's huge commitments to, what people traditionally think about renewables like solar and wind. RNG is there 24/7. The natural gas system does give us that, until battery technology is completely effective, right? We don't, there's a lot of challenges technologically to get to batteries. We're still going to need over the next couple of decades to get to that net zero future, natural gas to support the rapid transition to lower carbon and net zero eventually in 2050. You can also use it across sectors. It can be used in transportation. So, what we say is, this is a win across the board because, where there's direct use, right? If there's district heating or cooling, using turbines from gas, by sourcing renewable natural gas, those institutions, whether it's an industrial facility, a power generator, a hospital, a college or university, they can buy that RNG and without completely electrifying, which it is a good thing where it's cost effective and application appropriate. Great, but if they can't do that immediately by offsetting some of their traditional fossil usage through RNG, they're able to make a huge stride forward on their carbon reduction goal. Next slide, please. The reliability is key. I talked a little bit about energy storage. I mean, you see some capacity factors or generation factors here. About 25% for solar, 35% for wind. RNG is available all the time, and so that carbon reduction that's always going on is also providing energy in off hours at night or when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining. Next slide, please. And this, to me, kind of directly addresses Bob's earlier question around and Diane's comments about farming. The most exciting thing for me on this, frankly, is, I grew up in the southwestern part of Virginia. My brother-in-law actually still is a farmer, is a beef cattle farmer, and so I'm really excited in the fact that if we build out our entire program here in North Carolina, that's over 500 farms, and those are, as I mentioned, you may have heard me say, those are contract farmers. They're actually family farmers that own and raise and care for the animals, rather than having to necessarily maybe as Diane said, just take their land and convert it and lease it for solar. They can continue to be a family farmer, but they also get to be part of the new energy economy by getting paid for the energy they produce, which previously was just a liability. So they can diversify their income. They can make investments on their farm. They actually can invest in the digester itself, and so they have the tax benefits that go along with that, in addition to a completely new stream of revenue. Our first project, for example, is going to provide for the approximately 20 farmers more than $2 million a year in new revenue. So it's an exciting thing. It's very it's cool to partner with these farmers and understand how they can upgrade their facilities, improve air quality, reduce greenhouse gas, and make more money. So I think that's the end of my deck there, but appreciate the opportunity to talk about our program and look forward to having the opportunity to answer some questions here after we finish. Thanks, Bob. Bob, your brilliant thoughts are muted.
That's because they weren't brilliant. Thank goodness for that. You guys were spared. That was a great presentation, Ryan. I got a bunch of questions scrolling over here. They're very specific to renewable natural gas. I think you might see them if you got your comments up. The issue of these large agricultural operations, and they have these larger environmental impacts. And then you hit it at the very end. Your last statement before you finished was how, if done properly, this might reduce some of the other pollution issues that revolve around some of the large animal agriculture issues. So you might want to expand on it just a little bit. And also, I think for almost everybody who's not familiar with it, like, how the heck do we get that methane into the regular gas distribution? How easy and how complicated is that?
Sure.
Anyway,
So let me start, Bob. Thanks for that. I'll try to hit it kind of in a comprehensive answer and be fairly succinct. I think when you look at the overall environmental benefits of this, it's on a couple fronts. One, obviously, is air quality. The greenhouse gas mathematics that I went over is pretty straightforward, right? The 25-to-1. You also have a pretty big impact on hydrogen sulfide, which is also a byproduct that happens there and can have some odor reduction and general air quality improvements for the communities in which these farms have been around for decades. And then on the water quality front, what happens is it increases the retention time of the waste itself. And why that's important is you basically have, in a better way to say it is, you've got more infrastructure around. So if there's a storm event or something else, the retention times increase. There's more resiliency around the assets themselves, so you don't get runoff. You get less runoff, you get less flooding, and so you have less impact on groundwater. I think that hopefully hits that answer around the sort of multiple benefits there. I think that the second thing is, how do the projects work? Well, what we call it a hub and spoke. So what we try to do, rather than doing and some folks may have seen this before, particularly with some of the cooperatives that where there were different rec structures and so forth. Rather than setting maybe a small generator on one farm that's a 1 or 2 megawatt generator that tries to sell back electricity on the grid, that's pretty inefficient when you think about the economies of scale that come along with a large centralized generation unit. But what we can do is we can network between, call it 20 to up to 40 farms with some HDPE plastic gathering lines, like a hub and spoke. And then you take that to a centralized gas upgrading unit. Pretty straightforward. It can be either membrane based or pressure swing absorption based. Clean up, really, it's about 65 to 70% methane or natural gas. The balance being mainly CO2 with some trace amounts of H2S and other things. That strip out that CO2, and then you're going into, say Piedmont's distribution tariff there, injecting it in with some compression into the higher pressure line. So it's not unlike, frankly, what you would see in the old conventional natural gas gathering and small wells in Appalachia in West Virginia. But what you're doing basically is you're taking the production well of a hog lagoon and turning it into a waste to energy source.
So Ryan, there are more questions coming in on renewable natural gas. I mean, it's an amazing opportunity, yet a very challenging thing. But I'm going to move on so we can get to Andy. I know that a lot of people have some questions about this. If we have time before 2:30, we'll try to get maybe a few more, but I want to make sure we get to the other folks. So Andy, you're going to be up. And of course, the people who have more questions on renewable natural gas, it is something that you should explore. And I'm sure Ryan, if you have Ryan's contact information, you can, he can steer you around, because it's also the people in Washington State, people in the Central Valley of California. There's a lot of other places that are looking at how you blend this in, to reduce the overall carbon footprint. So, but Andy, you're going to be up. Andy's Vice President of Member Services and Corporate Planning for ElectriCities. And as the name implies, he's going to probably talk a little bit about what's going on in that arena. His experience includes strategic planning and portfolio management, deal structuring, renewable energy, smart grids. He's worked at General Dynamics and the Los Alamos National Laboratory. These are amazing resources for the country, the national labs. He holds 2 engineering degrees from MIT. and he's got an MBA from Duke University. So, Andy, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bob, and thanks for having me today. Getting an opportunity to talk with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about who Public Power is. I think I might be the first Public Power speaker today, and I think that will help me motivate a little bit of what we're doing today. But I also, in material, I'm going to talk about getting to 2050 as well, and really the main part of my presentation is going to be what obviously is happening on the other side of the meter with our customers. ElectriCities is a municipal membership organization based in North Carolina. We have two lines of business. One thing that we do is we provide wholesale power to 51 municipalities in North Carolina. And the second area where we focus on is we provide utility services to 86 municipal utilities across North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. In North Carolina, we represent about 10% of the load here. So I'll spend a slide on the Public Power business model because we are a little bit different. Municipal electric systems are electric utilities that are owned by the municipality. We're owned by local government. In North Carolina, at least, we are not regulated by the State Utility Commission. Rather, our regulating body is the city or town council. So city council sets rates for the retail customers. Since we are government owned, we're nonprofit, I should say. And also we have a real focus on keeping costs for our customers low, as well as focusing on the specific needs of our individual communities, because our customers are not only our customers, they're our citizens. To that end, these are just kind of some of the things that we do to engage with our customers and try to focus on what they want. And the good thing is, and I think one of our strengths is, those needs will vary from city to city and town to town based on where that city is and who the customer base is. We do a lot of work with customer surveys and focus groups. Our employees, not only interact with customers during their day jobs, but also they're, a lot of times next door neighbors with the customers as well. So we try to take note of what the folks want. We offer, we have a lot of the same, sorts of offerings that any utility would have. Strong focus on energy efficiency and demand reduction. Energy education also is something not to be overlooked and something that's in high demand among our customers. We engage with our customers through a number of different channels, much like most utilities today. I'll point out that we are more likely to have a walk-up window in City Hall for folks to come in and pay their electric bills. You can see that more with our sorts of utilities and other business models. Similar to other utilities, renewable programs, distributed energy resources are very significant for us and common offerings. And, we utilize these tools to help us specifically reduce demand, because a significant portion of our cost structure is based on demand. And, recently vehicle electrification is playing a major role with our cities, and especially those cities that are in the higher population areas near like Raleigh and Charlotte, because that's where we find folks are really interested in owning electric vehicles, and we've seen a significant uptick there. I think one differentiating factor for municipal electric utilities is we often, kind of go outside of normal electric utility operations. We have a strong emphasis on economic development, and usually we're, sitting right next to our economic development people when we're trying to recruit new business for the city. And also, and I'll touch on this later, is there's a specific focus on smart cities for us as well. So what I'm going to do here is, my apologies, let me go back. What I'd like to talk about is how some of our grid edge technologies build upon each other and what we're trying to do to assist our member utilities to move forward, okay? first off, I'll start in the blue circle in the center there, core digital technologies. For the past 10 years or so, we have really been placing an emphasis on the adoption of smart meters for our cities. Our smart meter adoption in the past 5 years has grown 700% amongst our utilities. So that's very significant. One thing to also point out is since these are all individual utilities, they have their own separate and distinct enterprise and billing systems. So it's very important that we encourage our cities to update those and get modern billing systems, because those are necessary to do things like capture the data that smart meters produce or enable our utilities to offer time of day rates. And, you know, one of the of adopting these core technologies is there's a lot of embedded analytics on them that now our utilities are beginning to use to, you know, add more value or derive more value from these investments. The next step, you know, after that kind of points to interoperability and integrating the smart meter technology with the other systems in the utility and the municipality. So we're also placing an emphasis on assisting our cities with integrating the smart meters with their outage management system, with creating a very detailed and accurate utility network model, as well as overlaying various layers of data, including GIS information, imagery, whether it's aerial imagery or you know, pictures of whatever the asset might be embedded in the database, as well as the specifications for those assets and any particular standards that might come into play. And this helps, you know, not only our engineers in the home office solve problems more efficiently, but it also helps our workforce in the field perform maintenance and restore power when that's necessary. So as you know, our utilities are investing in these technologies. Now they're beginning to be enabled to do, you know, kind of the next steps to adopt, you know, policies and practices that our customers really want, and that, you know, some of these grid ed technologies are demanding. So, you know, complex rate adoption, time of day rates is a big topic these days, and many of our utilities are moving over to that for their customers. Interconnection standards have been in place for a long time, but they constantly need to be updated to reflect the needs that are currently going on. And then energy efficiency programs and demand reduction all are beginning to evolve to be more user-friendly, to allow our customers to you know, engage in those activities when they want to engage in those activities, instead of being forced to you know, reduce demand or what have you. So then the technology and the policies then go to enabling our customers to adopt the sorts of technologies they want. Vehicle electrification is the main thing. If we can send our customers a price signal when the most appropriate time to charge their vehicle would be, they have a choice, and they can then make that decision themselves to charge at a lower cost time. Accurately, you know, compensating DERs and renewable resources on the grid is an important thing. And that's what some of these policies and procedures enable us to do, as well as the underlying technology. And then, you know, we can utilize other things like community resources, generators at customer-owned generators at their sites, and even energy storage today is becoming more and more common that we're seeing. And then, you know, the last thing I kind of want to point on here, and we're just beginning to get into this, is the smart city aspect of things. You know, I think it's for municipal electric systems, cities and towns that have a municipal electric system, I believe, have a leg up on other municipalities who don't, because once we've made all these technological investments, especially in the smart meter area and the communications network that's required to do that, the physical infrastructure is more or less there for the cities to then piggyback off of that onto other smart city applications. But beyond just the physical assets, the core competencies and the personnel assets that you need to run that system are also in place. So, you know, now we're seeing in a lot of our cities that they are adopting, you know, more frequently some smart city apps that affect other parts of the town other than the utility. So anyway, that's kind of what we're doing today. And but that doesn't get us to 2050, right? And I think there's some interesting things. Comment was, I think, made on the prior panel of, we picked targets out in 2050, but nobody really knows exactly how we're going to get there. And I would say that is especially the case when you talk about some of these data intensive technologies and assets. A lot of the stuff that I've just described really gets us 5 or 10 years in the future, if that. But I think, I'd like to talk a little bit about, well, what might 2050 look like? Okay. And, the interesting thing about everything that I've talked to you here is the life cycle of these assets is a lot shorter than perhaps the generation and transmission assets that you've heard earlier in the day. So we're going to, turn over many generations of these assets by 2050. And I think things will look very different by that point in time. So there are, I think, a number of common themes that will get us from where we are today, or perhaps in 2030 to 2050. One of it, which is, I think, to make this happen, there's going to be a bit of a convergence of a number of industries. Okay, so one that should be pretty straightforward is the energy industry and the telecom industry. I think the lines are going to kind of blur between those industries. I think also what comes into play is the automotive industry. Okay, we talk a lot about vehicle electrification. So there again, we're going to see that get pulled into the mix, as well as consumer electronics in general. So, some specific examples that I have on the page here, I mentioned complex rates on the last page. By 2050, I believe that's going to turn into something that I call transactive energy, which is basically energy with a real-time price signal. So individual consumers will have very accurate information in terms of what energy costs in that particular hour. It may be different from day to day, hour to hour. There's a lot that has to get put in place to make that happen, but I think that's kind of where we're heading. Vehicle electrification, I heard the term earlier, vehicle to grid. I think that definitely becomes more prevalent in the future, using the vehicle not only as a transportation asset, but a grid asset. I think we've heard a lot of that before. And, it's possible. I think it's coming. It just is going to depend on a few other things to get to that point. And also kind of a tie-in between electric vehicles and smart cities, right? If we move in a direction of autonomous vehicles, well, you will need some of that smart city technology to assist these vehicles if they're driving down the road. I mentioned next generation fuels. We're converting to electricity today, but by 2050, it may be entirely possible we're looking at something else. Hydrogen, fuel cells. I think that's entirely within the realm of possibilities. Standard programs today, in terms of EE or demand response or some distributed assets, will move into a perhaps more orchestrated way to utilize those assets. I call that building the grid. A concept where folks or entities that own campuses of buildings, maybe multiple apartment buildings, educational institutions, large industrial complexes. I think the infrastructure will be there to allow those buildings to act like a grid asset and either reduce load when needed or inject energy onto the grid as needed using the DERs that might be on site. And I couldn't come up with any better terms below, but I think, stealing a term from Yogi Bear, smarter than your average city today will eventually evolve into highly intelligent cities that will provide us some integrated end-to-end solutions and will definitely require strong interaction from their electric grid as well as other players. So, I'll just kind of close by saying I'm not trying to be a futurist. I could be dead wrong on all of these, but based on kind of the research I'm seeing, and you're talking about 2050, these are some things that we probably want to consider.
All right, Andy. Thank you for that. I want to note that there's been some discussion on the panel as well as in the chat area about low income impacts of many of these things. And somebody, I think it was Diane. Diane just posted a link to low and moderate income communities and electrification. I know that on electrifying transportation, we always think Tesla, right? But the bottom line is Lyft is moving to electrified vehicles on, in the shared economy. The secondary market for electric vehicles is starting to pick up. Most of the oil companies see price parity with electric motors to internal combustion engine cars in the showroom sometime in the 2024, 2025 time period. So it's not just, who's going to buy a Tesla? There's a lot of other things going on there in the electrification of transportation, including electrifying mass transit. Some of the other questions that came up that I'm going to throw out here, sort of in a lightning round, I think is the best way to do it. But Al, this started with you, but I wanted anybody to chime in. Is who is a good government? Who's the agency, or what is the institution, perhaps, to deal with some of the residential programs you were talking about?
There's a variety of options there, but for example, on the rental front, New Brunswick in Canada has approximately 300,000 residential meters, and they run a fantastic hot water rental program, and they buy units by the truckload. And by doing that, I believe they drive their initial purchase price down by 40%, which they're able to then pass on to their customers. So that's an example of a utility running a program. You could also have, and we have thought about this in the context of areas where there are lots of smaller utilities, but having an independent nonprofit entity that could run a rental program that then co-ops and municipalities could subscribe to. So those utilities would not have to make the investments in the staff and the back office infrastructure and so forth, and design it that way. So I think there are a lot of exciting opportunities, and it's a very good area for growth, and something that we should take a closer look at.
Okay. Anybody else have thoughts on what institutions might be helpful broadly in some of the ideas that you guys have brought up? It's okay. So one of the other things. Yes.
I was just going to say, I like what Al said about when it comes to who should fund and finance and everything. I think that we do need to look at some new models and some new ways of doing that. We also need to make sure that we're taking into account the benefits and the changes, again, in the energy sources that are supplying electricity, so that when you're looking at rebates and things like that, that you can provide rebates for electric appliances. Right now, they're at a disadvantage when you compare them to, say, natural gas appliances. And there's some statutes in place that prohibit rebates if it involves fuel switching. So there are some things like that I think we need to explore further.
Okay. Well, here's a general question. I think I'd like to hear from all of you on this, and we'll stick with you, Diane, to start. Even though I don't think any of you might be a specific expert in this, but I think you get the importance of it, and it's come up almost every time. When we're looking at beyond the assets of the power sector, one of the things that's interwoven in almost everything people talked about here is broadband internet, or maybe 5G or some other way for all of these things to be connected. I was thinking of how many what kind of bandwidth you need, Andy, for all the things on your chart, around the circle that you had. So Diane, what are you guys, particularly you guys are scattered around the state, what are you thinking about on this, and where are the soft spots?
It depends. We do have several of our co-ops that are looking at using some of what they have to be able to help with the middle mile when it comes to broadband. I think the challenge, and there are many challenges, is the affordability of it, and not taking on too large an investment that will raise power costs for everybody. So, it's something that our co-ops are looking at, are doing studies, and as I mentioned, a few are actually looking to help expand broadband.
Al or Andy or Ryan, thoughts?
This is Al. I would just add that, I think we need to take a look at broadband and think of it conceptually in a different way. It's almost, to me, become something that's so critical as a way of life that everyone needs access to it in order to function. It's hard to imagine now not having access to the internet in order to do the things you do on a regular basis. And certainly in the context of COVID, it's becoming particularly critical for our schooling our children. So I think that we need to think conceptually about it differently, perhaps in the same way that we fund highways. Maybe we should be funding broadband access across the entire state so that we're ensuring that everyone has access to it in the same way that we want to make sure that everyone has access to good paved roads, and think of it as a general public good that is provided to everybody. And conceptually, it's time for that sort of a change.
Hey, Bob, this is Ryan. I just would point out, and I'm not the expert on this from a Dominion standpoint, but we are in the process of partnering with Prince George Electric Cooperative in our Virginia service territory, to kind of partner with them. We sort of call it, we serve as the middle mile backbone, and the electric cooperative serves as sort of the last mile, to try to leverage our existing right of way and infrastructure to bring fiber into communities. I think, in the neighborhood of 4,000 or more that current customers that don't have that. So I think it's like a lot of the things we've talked about today. I don't know that we have there's one silver bullet, but this portfolio approach of different things, what Al's talking about, finding a way to maybe increase the broadband deployment broadly through some other broad program, but also looking at smart partnerships and innovative partnerships to do that as well, which, I'd encourage folks to look up our press release and some background on that, because I think it's an interesting concept.
Andy, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a couple things. Just to maybe a lesser extent, some of our cities are encountering the same things as some of the co-ops, because they too are in the rural areas. One thing I'll point out is right now in North Carolina, municipalities are prohibited from getting into the broadband business. There's public-private partnerships there that we can enter into, but we would also like to see a little bit more flexibility there, because a number of our citizens are in the same boat.
All right, so this is going to be the last question, and it's sort of a combo one. It's one that was asked a little earlier, and then another one that just came up. Obviously, a lot of these things that are outside the normal space of a power sector are becoming more and more important to it. And so legislative bodies get involved. I know all of you must love working with your legislative bodies. But also one of the questions here is, would a federal price on carbon be helpful? And I guess I could always say it depends on how the money gets spent, but we do have a national debt. But putting all that aside, you guys want to talk about the legislative process and how it relates to any of the work that you're doing?
Hey, this is Ryan. I think, it's when you look at RNG and sort of, I would say RNG is a little bit where solar was maybe 10, 15 years ago. And there's been lots of questions about supply and costs and that sort of thing. I think when you look at the broader scope of what we're talking about from a stakeholder perspective, carbon reduction is the ultimate goal. When you talk about net zero, when you talk about zero carbon, that is the focus. So I think having and I don't know that that's kind of a big thought, right? A federal price on carbon. How do you get there? Is it cap and trade? What's it look like? But I absolutely think that needs to be the focus. The way I have talked about it, with colleagues and other folks in the industry is, carbon is a cost, but so carbon reduction needs to have a value. and it's still you have to balance those two things. And they're the same, but they're different. And so, I think anybody who's dealt with broad sweeping legislation. I mean, I remember back with, Lieberman and others trying to look at cap and trade at one point. We spent a lot of time looking at that and baselining. I don't know that there's one thing that we'd all agree on, but I absolutely, when you look at what folks are focused on from a stakeholder perspective, figuring out some way to value carbon reduction and put a price or a value on it, I think would help drive energy forward, certainly.
Anybody else want any thoughts about legislative bodies and their role? I mean, obviously, that's a really important one that Ryan just laid out, some kind of national policy that tries to push and pull.
This is Al Ripley. I would just add that I think in the last year, 12 months, as you've looked at how legislative process has played out, it's these issues are very complex and has led to a lot of challenges in the legislative context. And I think all of us as stakeholders need to figure out ways that we can work together and try to bring legislative solutions that we can put into place and try to avoid some of the legislative dynamics that have led to sort of a stalemate and try to figure out how to get progress in place.
That's an excellent idea. David, I think we're 2 minutes away from your end time. I don't know if you have any guidance on timing here, but also there's a question here about sharing the slideshow that I'm going to leave to you to answer.
Yeah, so Bob, I think Diane was queued up for a response to your last question. We've got a couple minutes, so
go ahead, Diane.
Yeah.
Super quick. I was just going to say, when it comes to a federal price on carbon, it's the details. It's how you get there, and cost. We're cognizant of cost in line with our members' interests. It's worth talking.
Yeah, that's the classic, right? The devil's in the details.
So Bob, thank you, Diane, Al, Ryan, Andy, for sharing with us today. Really excellent. A good indication as to whether you did well or not is how well you held the participants on a Friday afternoon, and you did an exceptionally good job. Thank you very much.